Over the past week, I've gone down a unique rabbit hole of watching several videos arguing that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is overrated. Most of these videos start from very similar ideas. One is that Kareem is usually penciled in as the third greatest player of all time without much more thought put into it, and that's the wrong way to go. The other is that Kareem doesn't have a small, alternate GOAT case that puts him above LeBron James and Michael Jordan. I don't think that either of those arguments are inherently wrong, but I do believe that the majority of these videos go about arguing them in either a disingenuous or wrong way. The idea is presented as, Kareem isn't cared about, so his career doesn't get as much scrutiny, while they're now overanalyzing his career and holding him to a standard that's higher than even LeBron and Jordan. So today, let's go through some of those common critiques against Kareem. And at the end, I'll give my reason for why I think he's arguably the greatest player in NBA history. To start off, let's just list off the claims I'll address in this video. There are definitely more, and these are predominantly focused on the 70s, but I do think that these are the most common ones brought up against Kareem. Number 1. The 1970s was the weakest decade in NBA history, as greats from the 60s were aging out and the league's remaining talent was split by the ABA. What was left in the NBA wasn't anything extraordinary. Number 2. Kareem only won once he acquired a top 5 point guard of all time in Oscar Robertson. Even then, his 1971 championship came against weak competition. Number 3. Kareem was outplayed at his own position on numerous occasions as a Buck, and his overall lack of championship success during the 70s is largely his own fault. The 1975 and 1976 seasons stand out particularly as Kareem missed the playoffs in the middle of his prime. Somehow, he won MVP in the second of those 2 seasons, despite the fact that the Lakers won just 40 games. Number 4. Speaking of MVPs, Kareem having the title of most MVPs ever was obviously a product of his era. Not only did the ABA mean that some of the most talented players weren't competing for a championship, but it also meant the likes of Artis Gilmore and Julius Erving weren't snagging MVPs off of Kareem. Number 5. In the late 70s, Kareem continued to underperform by achieving just one 50-win season with the Lakers that ended up in a sweep to the Blazers to yet another rival big man in Bill Walton. The next 2 years saw similarly disappointing losses to the Supersonics. Kareem at this point had genuine talent with Hall of Famers like Jamal Wilkes and Adrian Dantley on his roster as well. Number 6. Once Magic Johnson arrived for the 1979-80 season, he took a roster that Kareem could barely elevate to 50 wins to a record of 60-22 as they made the finals. And you'll never guess who ended up as the finals MVP that year. Number 7. Kareem's longevity is overrated, and by the end of his career, he was racking up legacy all-star selections. This also means that the championship count really isn't as impressive as it's made out to be. And lastly, number 8. Kareem wasn't even viewed as the GOAT when he retired. It's people later on looking at his career that think he belongs there. Those are some pretty lofty claims, and if even half of them were true, then it would be a fair claim that Kareem is overrated and undeserving of a potential GOAT ranking. But that isn't the case. Let's start out with claim 1. I will concede that the 1970s is the weakest era in NBA history, and I don't think that you can argue otherwise. Except for, of course, the 40s and 50s, because, they were still learning how to play basketball. What I think is often over-exaggerated, however, is just how weak the era was and how much talent the ABA really had. In terms of peak talent, sure, the leagues were probably pretty equal with an edge to the NBA, but depth is another story. Jimmy Jones was a 6-time ABA All-Star and finished 4th all-time in ABA history for win shares. That's a pretty good career if you ask me, but you have likely never heard of him because once he got to the NBA, he turned into a role player for a single season before his career was ruined by leg injuries. By the time the ABA dissolved, Louis Dampier was the league's all-time leader in both total points and assists. He lasted 3 years in the NBA and never cracked double-digit scoring again. Matt Calvin was a 5-time ABA All-Star and made 4 all-league teams in his career. He never averaged more than 10 points a night in the NBA and was out of the league by 1981. Those aren't just random guys. They are all top 10 in ABA win shares, and 2 of them made the ABA all-time team. Sure, their playing time may have been reduced when they got to the NBA, but to me that just says that the coaches didn't view them to be nearly as special as they were in the ABA. Outside of the very top talent and maybe Mel Daniels and Dan Issel, you have never heard of an ABA player unless you've actively gone looking for them. And even then, comparing the timeline of those top players, Kareem was not missing much. Julius Erving and Artis Gilmore were rookies while Kareem was beginning his 3rd season. George Gervin started a year later in 1972 and 73 and is one of the rare examples of an ABA All-Star that peaked in the NBA. Calling Moses Malone an ABA player is a massive stretch considering he only played 2 years in the league and was far better in the NBA. And even Rick Barry was already back in the NBA by Kareem's 4th season. The ABA was a professional league with genuine talent, but this was not an evenly divided talent pool between the leagues. And that talent disparity gets even bigger when you realize that the NBA dominates the ABA when it comes to power forwards and centers. You know, the position that Kareem is going to match up against. The ABA had Artis Gilmore, Mel Daniels, and Dan Issel as its premier big men. Kareem, meanwhile, had to deal with the likes of Wilt Chamberlain, Nate Thurmond, Willis Reed, Dave Cowens, Wes Unseld, Elvin Hayes, and Bob Lanier. That means over a third of the NBA prior to the merger had a Hall of Fame big man on their roster. Reed, Lanier, Thurmond, and Chamberlain were also all either the same size or larger than the average center today. So no, Kareem wasn't dunking on a bunch of little guys. So while Kareem's era may have been weaker compared to other ones, there was still plenty of competition to go around. Let's move on to Claim 2. Now, I will agree that this path to the championship was a pretty big cakewalk. Rick Barry was doing his thing in the ABA, Jerry West tore his MCL, and the Bullets were dinged up, missing their leading rebounder. My simple response, however, is who the frick is stopping this team? The 1971 Bucks are one of the select few most dominant teams in NBA history. Dismissing that simply because their competition wasn't up to par come postseason time is a massive stretch, and also something that I bet few people would be consistent on for other teams throughout league history. My bigger problem with this claim, however, is it overrates Oscar Robertson. I think that a lot of times when people hear that the Bucks had Oscar Robertson, they envision 31, 13, and 11 Oscar, not 19, 6, and 8 Oscar. I think his Cincinnati days are heavily underrated when it comes to all-time discussions, and that's partly because he won a title as a Buck. Make no mistake though, Oscar wasn't the first or even second best point guard in the league by this point. Now I'm sure what some of you are saying, what about the finals? Unfortunately, the 71 finals, like a lot of Kareem's early career, have very little footage. What is available though is most of Game 4, which along with other regular season games from around this time, show us how this team operated. Essentially, everything revolved around Kareem in the post. He often gets boxed in this corner of just using the skyhook, when in reality he had an arsenal available to himself to score whenever he wanted. He had a reliable, though not very deep, mid-range game, had this weird fadeaway shot where he didn't really fade at all, and, if he was close enough, was going to slam it down on your head. He was deceptively athletic, and I mean that in the sense of you go from thinking, yeah, this guy isn't anything physically special, to holy crap, how did he just do that? On top of all this, Kareem was an amazing post playmaker and created plenty of opportunities for his teammates via handoffs, screens, and passing to cutters. I don't want to make it out like Oscar wasn't important to this team. He was, as a regular second option who provided some excellent veteran experience. If you were to look at the win pace the Bucks had with versus without Robertson in his 4 years in Milwaukee, then you'd find that without Robertson, they were on pace to win about 61.5 games. With him, that number improves dramatically to 62. Obviously, that is far from the best way to measure a player's impact, but that marginal increase with a sizable 40-game sample size does reinforce that this team's success was primarily due to Kareem. And also just based on statistics, Robertson was certainly not his former self by the end of his Milwaukee tenure. Claim 3 is a loaded one and the primary one that people look to say that Kareem is overrated. But for me, this is why I say the expectations for Kareem are stupidly high. Kareem played in 19 playoff series in his first 11 years. You want to guess how many of them saw his scoring average dip below 25 points per game? 2. Just 2. And when you look at these playoff series, who are the multiple guys that are supposedly outplaying Kareem? Willis Reed had an amazing series against a rookie Lou Alcindor. He got torched on the other end. Nate Thurmond did a pretty decent job in 1971 at holding Kareem to a lower than average field goal percentage. He was still getting completely outclassed. Wilt also did a pretty good job in that same year, but wasn't outperforming Kareem. If you try to convince me for a second that Wes Unseld was playing better, you might lose your basketball privileges. This is the only series where this claim is valid. Once again, Nate Thurmond did a pretty darn good job against Kareem, almost as if he was an all-time defender or something, but also outscored him, which is a pretty bad look. Except, one problem. His team lost the series. How often is it that a guy's team can win the series and he gets slandered for it? Unless you are literally the most polarizing athlete in modern history or freaking Jason Tatum, it isn't that common. The Bucks did lose the next series where Wilt did limit Kareem's efficiency, but for one, Kareem still averaged this, for two, Wilt averaged this, and for three, this is what the Lakers looked like in 1972. Yeah, I'm not holding that against him. Next year is the only true valid black mark on a young Kareem in my opinion. Once again, Kareem was matched up against Nate Thurmond, seriously underrated if you haven't been able to tell already, who didn't outplay him this time, but still limited him to a noticeable degree that led to an early exit for the Bucks. Now in the 1974 finals, I've seen multiple people bring up how Dave Cowens outplayed Kareem in Game 7, which is true to a slight degree. Why does that overshadow the fact that Kareem was the far better player the entire series and was the sole reason his team was even in that Game 7 to begin with? Just to spoil the rest for you, there isn't another guy besides Thurmond that outperforms Kareem in the playoff series up until 1981 when Moses Malone did so in the first round. Keep in mind, Malone was around his peak in 26 and Kareem was beginning to slip and was about to be 34. Afterwards, Kareem would get outperformed by a few other big men, notably by Malone again in the 1983 finals and by a young Hakeem Olajuwon in the 1986 Western Conference Finals. I think those are important to mention, but not to criticize for, considering that's what? The 7th and 5th greatest centers of all time? So overall, in his prime, he was limited in 2 playoff series by generational big men that were making all defensive teams and outperformed in a single one. That just isn't enough to knock him down several tiers when every great player has their bad moments. In the 2007 finals against the Spurs and 2008 second round against Boston, LeBron also struggled a lot to efficiently score against great defenses. In the 2011 finals, he was being outscored by Jason Terry, who is definitely a step below Nate Thurmond all time. I don't believe that those handful of series where LeBron underperformed takes him out of the GOAT debate, and most people feel the same way. Why would things be any different with Kareem? Now on to the 1974-75 season, where in the preseason, Kareem got hit in the eye. This led to 2 things. Firstly, he would now don his iconic goggles look to protect his eyes. Secondly, he got really mad and punched the base of the basketball hoop, breaking his hand in the process. He missed the first 16 games of the regular season, where the Bucks went, and I kid you not, 3-13. Not even Kareem could overcome such a disgusting start. In games with him on the court that season, the Bucks were on pace to win about 44 games. Definitely not a good mark. Without him, however, they were on pace to winning just 14, a mark that would have been the 2nd worst in league history up until that point. There were also real reasons that weren't Kareem's fault for why the Lakers missed the playoffs in the following season. The Lakers traded away 3 young promising players and their starting center to acquire Kareem. Meanwhile, some key contributors from the past few years, like Happy Harrison, retired while others like Gil Goodrich regressed. Despite heading to a team that lost talent and was still declining, Kareem elevated the Lakers from a previous record of 30-52 to 40-42. More than that, he also led the league in about 1 trillion stats that year. In fact, here's the 9 most commonly used advanced stats to measure how impactful a player is. You see how it's bold for Kareem? Yeah, that means he led the league in it. You want to guess how many players in NBA history have led the league in all 9 stats in one season? That's right, 0. And just to really hammer in how bad this Lakers team was, a box plus minus of 0 is generally viewed as a decent starter. Here's the box plus minus for all of Kareem's teammates that year. Yeah, not a single one of them cracked that threshold. I'm not pointing this out to say that Kareem deserved an MVP in a year where he missed the playoffs. I'm doing it to show that criticizing him for missing the playoffs is absurd because of how good he was in that year and how bad his team was. And connecting back to other all-time greats, do we not also give LeBron James and Michael Jordan a pass for the lack of success they had early on in their careers due to the lack of help they had around them? So again, why is Kareem being held to a higher standard than the 2 guys that are usually ranked above him? Quickly on to point 4, the ABA was not the NBA, and even with the former being an overall worse league, the only player with stats to actually challenge one of Kareem's MVPs was Julius Erving. 1971 and 72 are historic, top 10 MVP seasons of all time. There was nothing Dr. J put together that ever came close to them. 1974 was another really good MVP year where Kareem's numbers are pretty on par with Dr. J's numbers in the ABA from the same year. I doubt that one would switch hands. Obviously, we've already discussed 1976. If that award were to change hands, it would be because of team success, not because anyone was challenging Kareem individually for the title of best player in the world. And he won both his 1977 and 1980 MVPs in a league with former ABA players present. Even if you want to do this hypothetical game to take MVPs away from Kareem, at least be honest and acknowledge the 2 years where he arguably lost out on the award. In 1973, Kareem lost the MVP to Dave Cowens despite blowing him out of the water in just about every statistical way and being undisputably the best player in the world. Cowens only won the award because the Celtics won 68 games, but it's not like the 60-win Bucks were that far behind either. In 1979, he lost out on the award to Moses Malone, despite clearly still being the best player in the world. Maybe you could argue team success on this one because the Lakers only won 47 games, but slight problem. So did the Rockets. From Kareem's sophomore season to 1980, he was definitively the best player in the world from a statistical perspective, and even in 1981, there was still an argument to be made that he was the best. Any MVPs that you take away are canceled out by the MVPs he should have won, and you're fighting a losing battle by even arguing to take away MVPs from him. On to the 5th point, I think the 1978 season perfectly encapsulates why Kareem did not win anything with the Lakers up until Magic's arrival. Kareem once again broke his hand, this time on a guy's face, and missed 20 games in the season, though it was basically 21 because he barely played in the first game of the year. In that span, the Lakers went 8-13. That's a pace of about 31 wins in a full season. With Kareem, they had a record of 37-24, a pace of about 49 wins. Again, it's nothing amazing, but it helps to reflect these rosters were not quality. Yeah, but he had Hall of Famers Adrian Dantley and Jamal Wilkes? Right, Adrian Dantley. a known ball stopper who got shipped off of a team that was just in Game 7 of the NBA Finals because his playstyle did not help winning, a decision that was immediately validated the following year. And sure, Jamal Wilkes may be a Hall of Famer, but let's not kid ourselves. We know that not all Hall of Famers are made the same. He was a career 3-time All-Star and averaged 16 and 7 a night in his 2 seasons with Kareem prior to the arrival of Magic. Not exactly eye-popping numbers. I think one more point to really hammer in just how dependent this team was on Kareem is the 1977 playoffs. Kareem had to average 37 points and 19 rebounds a night with 5.5 stocks a game on 60% shooting from the field to drag his team past a 46-win Warriors squad in 7 games. It's no wonder why his team got swept by the Blazers, who were led by a Hall of Fame big man, which, by the way, Kareem did this too. On to point 6, this has to be one of the most confusing arguments I have ever heard multiple people try to tell me. You're telling me that if you add a top 10 player of all time to a team that already has a top 10 player of all time, that team gets dramatically better? Who would have guessed? It's not like Kareem all of a sudden didn't exist and Magic replaced him. He played every single game that season. Kareem literally won MVP that year while Magic didn't receive a single vote. In fact, he wasn't even close to winning Rookie of the Year. Bird ran away with the award. Everybody at the time knew who the lead player on this team was. It is absolutely an accomplishment that Magic impacted a team so much as a rookie. It just isn't a black mark on Kareem's legacy that he did so. But the real story from 1980 is the playoffs. In rounds 1 and 2, Kareem was doing what he had grown accustomed to at this point in his career and finally made it back to the NBA Finals where he was dominant. He sprained his ankle. Credit to Kareem, he came back and finished the game with 40 points to give the Lakers a 3-2 advantage over Philadelphia. But you know the story by now. Magic played center and dominated as a rookie, walking away with the Finals MVP in the process. Except there is a bunch more to that story than what is often told. Firstly, Magic did not play center the entire game. You see this guy right here? Yeah, that's 6'11" Jim Chones, an elite Wisconsinite and the man who actually played center for most of the game. Also, Kareem was literally robbed of the Finals MVP award. No, I don't mean that he had a better overall series than Magic, though he did. The voters gave him the award, but Kareem stayed home to recover in LA. CBS wanted someone at the game, so they pressured the voters to do a revote where Magic still barely won. If that were to happen today, all the media surrounding the NBA might burn the entire sport to the ground. But because it's Kareem and he lacks the appeal that every other all-time great has, it gets forgotten. To point 7, I see the argument, but I think it's misguided a bit. Past 1986, Kareem never averaged 20 points a night, and his last 2 All-Star selections were generous to say the least. But at the same time, I don't think it is properly appreciated that this man was an above-average role player at 42. Keep in mind, as I write this, there have only been 5 real NBA players to ever play a game at an older age than Kareem. At the time of his retirement, there had never been another NBA player to play their way to 40. Bob Cousy and a guy named Nat Hickey played in their 40s previously, but they were coaches at that point that put themselves on their team's roster. Keep in mind, he deservingly won a Finals MVP at age 37 as he dominated against the greatest front court in NBA history. And while his regular season past 1986 wasn't anything special, he was still probably the Lakers' second best player in the 1987 Finals at 40. His numbers were very similar to Worthy, but in the series-clinching Game 6, he exploded for 32 points and 4 blocks. This was an amazing game to watch because you have this grandfather who probably has Moses' phone number written down somewhere, facing off against 3 really good big men that are all in the Hall of Fame, and they can't do anything against him. Hook shot? Dunk? Block? Whatever you want, he's got it. If there is a game that exemplifies turning back the clock, it isn't anything from LeBron, it's this game right here. And sure, he fell off a cliff the following year and was probably the Lakers' 4th best player and didn't do much else when they got swept in 1989. But I don't think you realize just how incredible it is that he was still averaging over 10 points a night in the finals at that age. Here's a fun stat. There have been just 5 players in NBA history to play in an NBA Finals game after age 40. Keep in mind, we are using the term played very loosely. Udonis Haslem is on this list, but he's not even credited with a minute in the 2023 Finals, which I didn't even know was possible. The other 4 are Nasty Man, Herb Williams, Kevin Willis, and of course Kareem. On one axis, you have the minutes played in their Finals performance, and on the other, you have their total points, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks added together. Present is our first player in 1989 Kareem. Well, here's 1988 Kareem in comparison. And then way up at the top here, we have 1987 Kareem, the greatest 40-plus Finals performance of all time. And I kind of lied to you actually, because this isn't Malone or Willis or Williams or Haslem, it's all 4 of them put together. So even with his age kept in mind, Kareem was the best player on 3 of his championship teams. The 1982 Finals is a little weird because 5 guys average at least 16 a night, but I'll give Kareem credit as the second best simply because of his rim protection. That means that for another 2 of his championships, and at least the final series, series, he was the second best player on his team. And he has the 1988 championship on his resume, which still counts for something. Obviously, it isn't the quote-unquote magic 6 to equal Jordan, but how many guys have either equaled or surpassed being the best player for 3 championships, the second best player on 2 other championships, and having another championship to throw in at the end? You have Michael Jordan and Bill Russell. That's it. Kareem's longevity is obviously no longer number 1 because we have this guy running around still, but it is unquestionably a clear number 2. And to the last point, I've seen this a couple of times, and from what I've found, it's kind of correct. The thing is Kareem was far from a media darling. In fact, he hated the media, and the media reciprocated that feeling. So it's not a shock that some rankings had him lower than he should have been. There's also the obvious point that people in the 80s and 90s weren't really concerned with spending their time arguing about which bald man that dribbles a ball is better. And even still, I did find this article from 1986 that references a poll of the greatest player of all time, which Kareem won with 18 votes. The Big O is interestingly enough second with 14, and Wilt and Bill tied for third with 13. Obviously, even if this argument were 100% true, it's a weird thing to gatekeep where a thing can be placed in the future just because it used to be placed differently in the past. I mean, I doubt most of the people making this argument against Kareem really believe that Oscar Robertson should be ranked higher than Bill Russell and Magic Johnson all time. I think we now have a pretty good understanding at how Kareem fares against these criticisms. I don't expect you to 100% agree with my takeaways, but I also don't 100% expect you to believe in the original points against him. I find it very interesting that in the past few years, there's been this major push to say that with LeBron taking Kareem's spot as the king of longevity, his GOAT case is dead and never coming back. I think that type of thought process is a symptom of NBA fandom frequently believing that if you aren't first, you're last. When people debate Jordan or LeBron and try to do it in a civil manner, already crazy to imagine, I know, how many of them see that Jordan has 10 scoring titles and LeBron has 1 and just stop right there? Being first matters more than being second, but why are we ignoring the fact that LeBron finished second in total points scored in 8 straight seasons while regularly finishing top 10 in assists? And I think that's ultimately the thought process that needs to be had when making the case for Kareem. Because since LeBron has dethroned him as the king of longevity, he doesn't have anything major that he is the number 1 guy at. But I'd argue he's got the most well-rounded case of anyone. Yes, more than the 2 guys that rule this debate. Did he peak as high as Michael or LeBron? I'd say no, but 35 and 16 on out of this world efficiency leading one of the best teams ever isn't that far behind from what LeBron and Jordan were doing. His 6 rings might not be as strong as Michael's 6, but he still has more than LeBron. And while LeBron's longevity has surpassed Kareem's longevity, he still has that edge over Michael by a wide margin. All of this while passing the eye test with flying colors and being more entertaining to watch than most people give him credit for. And none of this even considers the fact that if we are talking strictly a basketball player, nobody comes close to him in terms of high school and collegiate dominance. I think the biggest thing that hurts Kareem is that he is the most boring narrative of basketball's traditional pantheon. Larry and Magic saved the NBA. Russell is the greatest winner in a game that has the ultimate goal of winning. Wilt, just really big numbers everywhere, so on and so forth. And when we get to Kareem, we get to a guy who doesn't have that same excitement. It is true that he just gets penciled in at 3rd place, and I think that people want to push back on that. But when you give him a fair evaluation and hold him to the same standards of every single other all-time great, I think it's pretty clear. Kareem is not overrated. He's arguably the greatest of all time. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed, please consider leaving a like, commenting, and subscribing, as only a small percentage of you are, and also checking out this last video, diving into some of the absurd statistical achievements made by Wilt Chamberlain. Have a great day, everybody.